In the hushed stillness of Finch's saloon, where the piano's keys marked by the smudges of desperate hands and splashes of spilled whiskey lay silent, an air of somber reflection hung heavy. Here the scent of aged cigars mingled with the odor of men whose prayers had long been forgotten, and laughter rang out sharp and cruel, devoid of warmth or comfort. Into this dim, smoky atmosphere stepped Eli Shepherd, his boots barely whispering against the wooden floor. His purpose was singular, devoid of the usual saloon pursuits. He sought neither women whiskey nor companionship. His mission was simple: to confirm a grain delivery, collect his due, and retreat back to the solitude of his homestead. The night bore down on him heavy with the presence of unseen specters, and he hadn't uttered a single word since the morning's light. Yet as he scanned the room, his eyes caught sight of an unexpected trio, their forms almost spectral in the bar's dim lighting. The first was a youthful figure no older than 19, draped in a yellowed wedding dress that hung awkwardly on her slight frame. Her arms bore the scars of too many encounters with hot stoves, her gaze fixed on her own shoes as if they might whisper secrets she dared not speak. Beside her, a woman with shoulders wide and strong stood like a sentinel. Her russet hair framed a face set in stoic resolve, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her dress straining at the seams, while the men's mocking laughter did nothing to break her stern focus on the floor beneath her feet. And then there was the third, distinct in her bearing, as if she were a visitor from another world. She held her head high, the left side of her face cast in shadow, but when she turned, Eli saw it, her left eye clouded white like a moon cloaked in storm clouds. Yet the rest of her exuded a quiet dignity, the air of one who had once taught perhaps or nurtured young minds. Eli stood there, his eyes locked on the scene before him, the straightness of her spine telling a story of defiance and despair. They were not speaking, they were not smiling, they were weighting their silence heavy with the weight of their plight. He knew deep within this wasn't a dance, nor was it marriage. It was shame being sold by the hour. Silas Finch, the saloon keeper, was there wiping a mug with a rag as dirty as the transactions he was brokering, calling out bids with the same zeal he'd use at a cattle auction. "Who will start us off for the blonde one, a bit shy, but she'll warm to kindness," he bellowed. Someone laughed, a sound as harsh as the desert wind. Another voice, thick with drink, offered half a jug of rye for a night's favor, igniting a roar from the crowd. Eli's boots remained rooted in the sawdust, yet something within him turned colder than the winter's bite. A memory surfaced, vivid and painful. His wife Anna, before the wasting sickness took her before she bled out alone, the doctor arriving too late. She had been rejected by 3 suitors labeled as too skinny, too plain, too serious. He had loved her for all those reasons, for her unique essence. Now here were 3 women marked with the same cruel labels, wearing them like scarlet letters of crime. The youngest flinched as a man with a jest reached to inspect her teeth, treating her as livestock. In that moment, Eli stepped forward, his presence as silent and enveloping as fog. He didn't glance at the men. His gaze was fixed solely on Finch. "Calm and low," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his resolve. "I'll take all 3. The laughter halted, a cough broke the silence, and Finch blinked in disbelief. "All 3? You drunk already, Eli?" Eli reached inside his coat, laying down a handful of coins on the bar, clean silver hard-earned, the kind that didn't clink, but settled with the quiet authority of a promise. "They're not cattle, Silas," he declared, his voice steady. "They'll come with me." A young red-faced man, angered by the sudden silence, spat near Eli's boots, his action a testament to the hostility of the environment. "What was going through your mind, Shepherd? Were you planning to construct your own sanctuary, a small haven of solace?" Eli remained silent, his intentions shrouded in mystery. With a subtle gesture, he sidestepped and swung open the saloon door. The storm had yet to unleash its fury, but the air was heavy laden with the scent of impending rain. For a fleeting moment, the world stood still. Then the proud one, the school mom, emerged first, her gaze fixed forward, passing Eli as if he were nothing more than a whisper in the wind. The broad-shouldered woman followed suit, her presence as commanding as ever. And finally, the girl in yellow, her arms still wrapped around her, stumbled out as if she awaited an intervention that never came. They disappeared into the embrace of the night, their dresses trailing behind like remnants of tales untold. Eli, in a solemn procession, led them to his wagon. The horses, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stamped their hooves, their eyes wide with uncertainty. None of the women questioned their destination, and Eli, in turn, offered no explanation. The journey stretched on in a silence that was both comforting and contemplative. Lena, the youngest, succumbed to sleep, her head resting against the sideboard. May, her posture rigid, seemed to challenge the darkness itself as if it held secrets she was determined to uncover. Anjan, with her clouded eyes, sat with hands folded, her demeanor almost prayerful. The moon, when it finally broke through, appeared pale and crooked, casting a ghostly light upon the scene. Eli stole a glance back at his silent companions. These women who had been cast aside by life, yet carried within them a resilience that belied their outward frailty. He pondered if he was their savior or if perhaps they were his. The cabin loomed into view just before dawn, its simplicity stark against the backdrop of the encroaching day. It was plain wooden with shutters that hung loosely and steps worn smooth by years of use. A single lantern flickered in the window, casting a warm, if feeble glow. Upon arrival, Eli did not assist them down. He merely unlocked the door and stepped aside, his voice low and somewhat apologetic as he said, "It ain't much, but it's clean." Inside the cabin was humble, a hearth for warmth, two cots for rest, and a long rug once cherished by his late wife. Dust danced in the beams of light that filtered through the windows. The silence that enveloped them was not oppressive, but rather it was filled with the gentle promise of a new beginning. In the tender embrace of June, the cot near the window became her silent companion. Meanwhile, May, with a weary groan, stretched her back on the rug, her body protesting the night's rest on the floor. Lena lingered by the door, a specter of uncertainty, her presence a question mark in the dimly lit room. Eli, ever the silent provider, placed water and bread upon the table, a simple offering for the night's sustenance. Without a word, he tipped his hat a nod of farewell and retreated to the porch where the cold wind kissed his jaw. The creak of a chair announced June's arrival beside him, her silence a loud echo of the unspoken. Together they watched the horizon where morning gently bled into shades of soft gray, whispering promises of renewal. What was this feeling, this budding warmth within Eli's chest? He had no name for it yet, but it felt like the first tendrils of hope. The sun ascended with a shy reluctance, its rays hesitantly caressing the weathered planks of Eli Shepherd's homestead. Here the morning light revealed 3 wedding dresses, their fabrics still heavy with the night's fog, each exhaling ghostly wisps into the crisp air. The homestead was silent, save for the gentle creaks of wood and the hushed whispers of a fire being kindled, painting the sky in hues of gold. Lena, in her delicate nightgown, was the first to stir, stepping barefoot into the kitchen. Her hair still tightly pinned framed her small, resilient frame. Her arms, marked by the echoes of past hardships, reached for a pan, her movements silent, born not of stealth, but of habit. Eli observed her from the barn's window, her hands breaking eggs with a practiced ease, stirring them into a simple meal, as if half expecting interruption. May, with a sigh that spoke of aching bones, rose from her makeshift bed, her joints cracking in protest. Her hair pulled back with twine, she stepped into the cold, paying no mind to the chill that nipped at her skin. She found the axe, its weight familiar in her hands, and began to chop firewood with a rhythm that spoke of determination. Each swing was a clean, precise arc, the axe biting into the wood like it had a personal score to settle. The sleeves of her borrowed shirt stretched tight across her back, yet she persisted, relentless in her task. When Eli approached, she didn't lift her gaze, merely commented, "This fence of yours looks like it's lost all will to stand." Her words were a mere whisper over the sound of wood splitting until sweat beaded on her forehead like morning dew. Meanwhile, June stayed within the warmth of the house, her dress from the previous night now a neat square on the windowsill. She had donned a faded green blouse and a skirt that seemed to recall a time when it fit another's frame. It's him, brushing against her calves with a whisper of memory. In front of a mirror, its glass cracked like a frozen lake. She brushed her hair with strokes as even as her heart beat. Her left eye, cloudy and unyielding, stared back at her, a silent testament to the passage of time. Eli, leaning against the door frame, cleared his throat, drawing her attention through the reflection. "You ain't got to do anything," he said, his voice a gentle breeze. "Not unless you want to." Her reply was a soft murmur, yet it carried the weight of resolve. "Idle hands get gossiped about." He offered no further words, for the house had begun to change. Once a shrine to absence, with his wife's shawl still draped over the mantel and a child's toy hidden under the bed, it now hummed with quiet activity. The kettle sang its song, the broom danced across the floor, and laughter, sharp and fleeting, broke the yard's silence. May, with her fierce spirit, had broken the axe handle. "Damn it," she muttered, a grin playing at the corners of her mouth, only to wince as a splinter found its mark. Lena hurried out with a cloth, but May waved her away. "I've bled worse over stew pots." Yet she allowed Lena to wrap her thumb in the younger girl's hands, trembling slightly. Behind them, Eli was at work, each tap of his hammer, a heartbeat of the house coming back to life, mending the fence one nail at a time. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ranch, the air seemed to hum with the echoes of distant hoofbeats. By midday, a serene rhythm settled over the place, a silent truce among the inhabitants. June, with her gentle touch, wiped down the shelves, breathed life into the dusty windows, and lost herself in the worn pages of an old book during the lazy afternoons. Her words, when spoken, were few but profound, each one carrying the weight of unspoken stories. Lena, in her quiet world, kneaded dough for flatbread, her hands moving in a dance of silence, her voice a tuneless hum, a melody of repetition and solitude. Meanwhile, May, with her fierce determination, hauled water from the well, her muscles straining against the weight, her spirit unyielding, as if she were challenging an unseen adversary with every bucket she carried. The townsfolk, however, were not so reticent. By evening, Miss Tansy made her way to the ranch, her shawl draped over her shoulders like a mantle of weathered experience. She carried no gifts, no pretenses, just her presence and a look that spoke of too many winters. "You know what they're saying," she declared to Eli, who was meticulously oiling a lantern on the porch, his focus unwavering. "They call you a fool, saying you've bought 3 brides, one for each sin you bear." Eli's response was calm, his gaze not lifting. "Let them talk," he murmured. Miss Tansy's eyes narrowed, piercing through the gathering dusk. "You have plans for these girls, shepherd." Eli's reply was as simple as the truth he held. "I have space. They needed it." Tansy's gaze then shifted to the figures moving within the house. "May's the strong one," she noted, her voice carrying a hint of admiration. "Cracked a boy's jaw once back in Tennessee." Her eyes moved to Lena. "Not from here, she's some cook's daughter, I reckon." And then to June. "She used to teach until some fool threw boiling oil in her face during a church brawl, called her a witch for knowing Latin." Eli's jaw tightened at the injustices, recounted the unfairness of it all. "And yet the town still points at them, not the men who did it," he observed, his voice edged with frustration. Tansy let out a snort at the sound sharp in the quiet evening. "You think the wind don't carry old sins just because they're quiet. You're either their savior, Eli, or their next mistake." Meeting her eyes squarely, Eli responded, "I'm not either." That night, as the stars began to pepper the sky, Lena set the table with bread and soup. Her movements graceful, yet she did not join the others. May, ever the provider, brought a chair from the corner, the wood creaking under the weight of her determination. As Eli settled onto the porch with a weary grunt, June hesitated, her spoon hovering above her bowl, until Eli ventured the first bite. The air hung heavy with a sacred silence, an unspoken reverence filling the room. Suddenly, June's voice sliced through the quiet. "Do you plan to marry any of us?" Her question halted Eli mid-bite, his fork pausing in the air. "No," Lena murmured, her gaze dropping to her lap, a gesture of quiet resignation. "Good," June replied firmly. "We didn't come here to replace ghosts." Eli nodded, his voice soft with understanding. "You came here to escape men like Finch." The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of their unspoken histories pressing down. Then with a deliberate motion, May leaned back in her chair, balancing precariously on two legs. Well, as long as we know where the lines are drawn, we might all rest a bit easier tonight. Outside, the wind began to dance, stirring the leaves with a whispered urgency. Eli stepped back onto the porch, his boots thudding softly against the wood. May followed, clutching a splintered piece of fence wood and a carving knife. She settled on the steps, her hands moving rhythmically as she carved the blade, whispering against the wood. "You don't trust easily," Eli remarked, his eyes on the moon, a distant pale orb in the night sky. May let out a snort, her carving pausing. "And you do?" "I did once," he admitted, his voice tinged with a wistful note. "Then I thought I was saving you all. But perhaps I'm just as lonely as you." "I am," he confessed, his voice steady. "But that doesn't mean I'm wrong." As the moon slipped behind a cloud, the chill of the night deepened. May's voice softened, almost lost to the wind. "You know, I grew up dreaming I'd marry a blacksmith or a farmer. Never expected to be told I was too much, too tall, too loud, too much woman for one man to handle. They threw it at me like an insult, but I wore it like a badge of honor." Eli turned to her, his eyes seeking hers in the dim light. "Maybe you weren't too much. Maybe they were just too little." May met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the flicker of the lantern, a spark of something new kindling within them. "Maybe." Inside, Lena watched from the window, her face half illuminated. One hand resting against the glass, her heart echoing the quiet tumult of the night. June's eyes, like pools of glass, seemed to hold a distant memory as she continued her reading, her voice a soft melody in the quiet room. The book she cradled was old and worn, its pages whispering tales of redemption, a theme she lingered on with each turn. Eli later would find himself alone by the fire, the house around him alive with the soft sighs of settling wood. He did not yet grasp their full stories, these women who had come into his life like seeds beginning to stir beneath the warming soil. They were not his to claim or to save. They were individuals, their shadows not a source of fear, but of curiosity. He recalled his mother's words, a faint echo in the chambers of his memory. "You don't need to fix the whole world, Eli. Just give someone a place to rest a while." Here in this once silent house, now pulsing with new life, three women found their breath again. Not because Eli rescued them, but because he did not attempt to possess them. And that, in essence, was everything. The wind on the third day shifted, sweeping and low and dry from the canyon, testing the resilience of both doors and spirits. The morning unfolded with its usual rhythm. Lena, with her gentle hands, cared for the hens. May, her focus sharpened tools. And June by the window, her fingers tracing words as if to rediscover the heartbeat of language itself. Eli observed from afar, a silent sentinel, careful not to intrude upon their newfound space. Yet an invisible tension threaded through the air, tightening like a noose. That afternoon, the peace was shattered when Lena dropped a plate, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Her hands flew to her chest as if to cage her beating heart, her eyes wide, lost in a sea of fear. The others rushed to her, drawn by the clatter, but Lena's gaze remained distant, haunted by shadows of the past. She shook her head, silencing the others before they could utter a word. "It was nothing," she whispered, her voice barely a wisp of sound. "Just the wind." But it wasn't. A man had appeared riding down the path, his presence as unwelcome as a storm cloud on a clear day. Not a lawman nor a neighbor. Eli knew him from the saloon, a thick-shouldered brute whose sneer remained etched on his face even when he pretended to smile. His name was Clay Bishop, a ranch hand who on the night of the auction had drunk too much and placed a mock bid on May. He hadn't been laughed out. He had left of his own accord, his face as red as the setting sun, his snarl a warning to all. Now there he stood at the very edge of Eli's land, his hand resting on his belt, like a man who believed the world owed him a debt. Eli descended from the porch, his steps measured, his voice firm. "You're not welcome here," he declared, his tone as cold as the winter's first frost. Clay spat into the dirt, his disdain palpable. "Ain't here for you," he retorted, his voice slick with an oily confidence. I've got a claim. He claimed he'd paid for her fair and square. May emerged then barefoot, her face streaked with dust and sweat. She stood beside Eli, her presence a silent testament to her strength. Her hands were steady, her gaze unyielding. "You've got nothing," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You offered a bottle of rye and a jest. That ain't no claim." Clay's smirk widened. "You think you're too good for me now." "I was always too good for you," she replied, her words as quiet as thunder echoing in the stillness. Clay shifted, perhaps readying for a confrontation, but Eli remained unmoved, his arms loose at his sides, his eyes as steady as the mountains. It was then that Clay noticed the rifle leaning against the porch post, untouched, unthreatening, yet undeniably present. "You can ride off," Eli stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Or you can limp off, but either way you're leaving." With a sharp, mean laugh, Clay turned his horse, not rushing, ensuring his departure was as deliberate as his arrival. Men like him never hurried away. They wanted you to remember they might return. The silence that settled after his exit was thick-laden with the unspoken words and the weight of what was left unsaid. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, yet she did not waver. She returned indoors, the weight of the day heavy upon her shoulders, poured herself a glass of water, and took a seat at the table. The evening deepened into night before she dared to voice her fears. What will we do when the next man comes? Her question hung unanswered in the air, a silent acknowledgement of their shared vulnerability. As darkness enveloped their world, they drew nearer to the fire's warmth, seeking comfort in its flickering light. May, with an intensity that bordered on obsession, sharpened a knife repeatedly, the sound a steady heartbeat against the night silence. June, in a futile attempt at distraction, held a book but never once turned a page, his mind elsewhere. Lena, her gaze ever watchful, frequently stole glances at the door as if expecting an unwelcome visitor at any moment. Eli, meanwhile, sat with his back to the window, his eyes tracing the dance of shadows, a silent sentinel in the gloom. Later, when solitude wrapped the farm in its quiet embrace, Eli found May outside, her silhouette framed against the barn. "You did good today." He offered, his voice a gentle murmur. She responded with a shrug, her voice tinged with resignation. "I didn't do nothing." "You stood your ground," Eli countered, his words carrying a weight of admiration. May's eyes lifted to the vast indifferent skim. "It never ends, does it? The proving, the fending off, even when you've done everything right." Her words were not a question, but a statement of the relentless cycle they were caught in. Eli, lost for words, chose instead to join her in silence, both facing the endless prairie as if it might yield some solace or answer. "I've got nothing but of this land," Eli confessed, after a prolonged silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's all I know. I plant things, fix things, keep things going. I don't know how to fix people." "You're not supposed to," May replied, her voice steady. "Just don't break us more." Her plea was simple yet profound, a request for preservation rather than restoration. Eli nodded, understanding the depth of her wish. No miracles were needed, just the absence of further pain. By dawn, June had made a decision. The neighbor's boy Simon had appeared at their door with a sheepish grin and a book clutched in his hand. "Pa says I can't read for beans," he announced, and added, "Ma says you used to be real smart." June, momentarily stunned, invited him in, her hands trembling as she took the book. For the first time in a long while, she did not sit by the window where shadows of past fears lingered. Instead, she sat at the table, the morning sun softening her clouded eyes. Though smiles were rare that morning, a small one graced her lips, a flicker of hope in a world too often dark. In a moment of unexpected courage, Eli caught sight of something extraordinary. In Lena. Dear Lena, she astounded everyone. With a newfound boldness, she declared her wish to venture into town. No one coerced her, yet when she spoke, her stature seemed to grow as if her request was of great significance. "Just for sugar," she added hastily, "perhaps also for flour." May ever the companion offered to accompany her. June, always prepared, had mentioned she'd compile a list. Eli, with a protective tone, instructed them to return before nightfall, but Lena, with a resolute voice, said, "I want to go alone." And so she did. Adorned in a scarf and a gray shawl, Lena's steps were purposeful. Her hands remained tucked in her sleeves, yet when she paid the grocer, her fingers trembled, but her gaze was unwavering. Eyes followed her. They always did. Some murmured secrets to one another. Others chose to cross the street. Yet Miss Tansy, sweeping her porch, simply acknowledged her with a nod. Lena returned the gesture, her heart pounding. She made it back before the sky kissed the horizon with gold. Eli was in the barn, his hands busy mending tack. Lena walked straight to him, the sack of flour in her arms. He took it silently, then handed her a napkin neatly folded. "What's this?" she inquired, her voice barely a whisper. "Apple jam. You forgot it," he replied. Her eyes welled up, tears clinging to her lashes. "I didn't mean to cry," she whispered. "I know," he responded, his voice gentle. The days that followed were tranquil, marked by a subtle shift. Simon came back for his lessons. May, without being prompted, fixed the pantry door's hinges. June's voice, once silent, now hummed through the house. Lena, in her quiet rebellion, planted seeds in the window box, basil, thyme, and some mysterious sprouts she'd rescued from forgotten kitchens. The ranch began to breathe, not perfect, not whole, but alive. Then, like an omen, the sheriff appeared one morning. His boots were heavy with the dust of the road, yet his hat was too pristine for a man who claimed to know hardship. Eli met him at the gate, his expression guarded. "Words come from Finch," the sheriff announced. "Says there's—" The evening shadows lengthened as Eli shared the unsettling news with the women. The townsfolk were restless, whispering tales of unnatural arrangements. "Finch sold what wasn't his," Eli had replied earlier, to the sheriff's probing, his voice a mix of defiance and concern. The sheriff, perhaps swayed by the town's unease, had issued a warning rather than a threat, leaving behind a cloud of suspicion as he departed. Ma's jaw tightened, her eyes burning with a fierce resolve. "They think we're his still," she murmured, her voice laden with the weight of unspoken battles. June, ever the voice of reason, nodded, her gaze distant. "Freedom always looks like danger to small minds." She stated her words, a soft echo in the room, now filled with the scent of something savory cooking on the stove. Lena, silent until then, sat beside Eli on the porch later that night. The wind, now a mournful companion, howled around them, carrying the distant cries of coyotes across the vast, lonely plains. She clutched a blanket close as if it could shield her from the memories of a life where freedom was but a word passed from kitchen to kitchen, hand to hand, her worth always measured by others. "I was never free," she whispered into the night, her voice barely louder than the wind. "Not really." Eli, his gaze lost in the darkness, did not turn to look at her. "Do you feel free now?" he asked, his question hanging in the air, mingling with the night's chill. She paused, the silence between them filled with the haunting song of the coyotes, a hymn of the wild. "I don't know," she finally answered, her voice trembling with a newfound awareness, "but I feel seen." The rain arrived with the dawn on Sunday, not in gentle whispers, but in a torrential downpour that beat against the windows like a divine judgment. Thunder rolled across the plains, not in anger, but with the steady, ominous beat of a drum heralding a reckoning. Inside the cabin was an island of warmth, the fire crackling in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. June lit the lamp, its light a beacon of hope amidst the storm. May stirred something thick and fragrant on the stove, and for a fleeting moment, as the world outside raged, the cabin felt like a sanctuary, a place where grace might just find its way through the tempest. As the morning light crept through the windows, the room was suffused with the scent of damp cotton and the lingering aroma of boiled beans. June was by the hearth, her hands wringing out Lena's dress, each drop of water a testament to the night's toil. Beside the stove, May diligently dried her boots, the steam whispering secrets of the cold outside. Eli, silent since the break of dawn, sat at the old wooden table, his hands methodically sharpening a knife. The rhythmic sound of metal scraping against stone was the only conversation in the room, a melody of tension and resolve. Lena had spent the night baking biscuits, a rare sweetness in their often harsh lives. The kitchen still held traces of clove and burnt sugar, a memory of warmth that none had the heart to partake in. Then came the knock, soft, yet carrying an undercurrent of threat. Sheriff Hammond stood at the door, flanked by his deputy and a stranger whose mustache was too meticulously groomed for a man of honest labor. A covered wagon waited behind them, its tarpaulin flapping ominously in the wind. "Got some paperwork," the sheriff announced, his voice a flat line of duty. "You ought to read it." Eli's gaze was hard, his voice even harder. "What's the charge?" "No charge," the stranger interjected, his tone dripping with false kindness. "Just a matter of clarification. Ownership dispute. Technically speaking, these women were contractually bound to certain debts." His eyes flicked over Eli, dismissive. "Finch sent us. He's filed a claim. He's willing to forgive those debts if they return voluntarily. We don't want trouble, just resolution." May her presence suddenly filling the doorway, her voice steady. "We ain't contracts. We're people." The man tipped his hat, his gaze averted. "Doesn't change the records." "And you think a bottle of whiskey and a laugh count as legal tender?" June's voice came from behind, sharp as a whip. The man blinked, taken aback. "We'll let the court decide that." Inside, Lena stood by the window, her hands knotted in her apron, her breaths quick and shallow. Eli stepped forward, mud squelching under his boots. "They're not going anywhere." The sheriff sighed, a weariness in his eyes. "Eli, don't make this harder. The town..." The whispers had grown into a roar, a storm of judgment that lashed at the ranch like the relentless rain. 3 women unwed, living under the same roof with a widower, the church folks murmured. "Think of the scandal." Eli's voice, rough as gravel, cut through the air. "I didn't stir up trouble. I sheltered those in need." The rain intensified as if nature itself wept at the injustice. The sheriff, his words lost in the downpour, turned the wagon around, leaving behind legal papers pinned to the fence post. They fluttered like the wings of a caged bird weighed down by a stone. June, with her sharp eyes, scanned the documents quickly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "They're just trying to frighten us with legal threats and nonsense," she declared. May, ever defiant, struck a match against the stove, igniting the edge of the papers. "Let him send more," she challenged, as the flames danced and devoured the parchment. June watched the last ember fall, knowing well that fear doesn't burn away so easily. By afternoon, the whispers had solidified into accusations. Wagons slowed on the ranch road, their occupants gawking. A stone hurled by a fleeing boy struck the ground, and someone had scrawled "shame" in pig's blood on their water barrel. Lena, upon discovering it, scrubbed with such ferocity that her knuckles bled, trying to erase the word that seared her soul. As dusk fell, Miss Tansey arrived, breathless and drenched. "They're convening a council," she gasped, her voice quivering. "The elders, the shopkeepers, everyone. They're set to meet in the chapel tomorrow night. They'll decide if you should stay or if you should go." June stood resolute, her face a mask of calm. "Let them decide," she said simply. May turned to Eli, a flicker of desperation in her eyes. "If we leave now, we could avoid the worst of it." But Eli, his face set, shook his head. "You don't flee from a fire you didn't ignite." Lena, silent, sat at the kitchen table, her eyes wide with unspoken fears. That night, Eli patrolled the fence line, lantern in hand. The rain had ceased, but the wind, a silent witness to their plight, still whispered through the tree, carrying tales of defiance and resilience into the night. There, under the moon's watchful gaze, a figure lingered near the tree line, his eyes fixed on a fleeting form that vanished before he could utter a word. He didn't pursue. Instead, he stood still, his heart heavy as stone, his hands firm as oak. They were testing him, testing them all. The next evening, the chapel swelled with the townsfolk before the bell's chime could even echo through the valley. Eli entered late, his hat clutched in his hand, boots caked in mud, yet his posture was unyielding. He walked in solitude, the room hushing to a whisper as he passed. At the altar stood Pastor Vaughn, his beard like frost, his eyes hollow, his voice crackling like autumn leaves. Nearby, the sheriff sat, his gaze stern. Finch wasn't there, but his men were, Eli noted. Store owners' wives with tight lips and boys with stones in their pockets filled the pews. "You're here to defend your conduct, Mr. Shepherd," Pastor Vaughn began, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. 3 women without ceremony or kinship under your roof. The Lord frowns upon impropriety. Is kindness now improper? Eli retorted, his voice calm yet piercing. There are rules, the pastor countered, and there are people. You all watch them being sold like mere cattle. Eli's voice rose not in volume but in clarity. Not one of you lifted a finger to stop it. I did. A murmur rippled through the congregation. Someone scoffed. Someone whispered, sin. Eli continued, I never touched them, never claimed them as mine. I just gave them space to mend their souls, something this town never offered. Then June stepped through the doorway, her voice cutting through the silence like a bell. You speak of sin, yet turn away from cruelty. You label us as fallen, but we are the ones who rose from the ashes. May followed her voice steady. We built that ranch with our silent labor. No man laid a hand on us. We are not your scandal. We are your shame. Lastly, Lena entered, her hands trembling red and raw from endless scrubbing. She didn't speak. She simply extended her hands, a silent testament to their toil. This is what we do, Eli declared, his voice firm, yet filled with a poignant sorrow when no one else will. Pastor Vaughn hesitated, his resolve wavering, as a few heads turned, their expressions shifting in the dim light of the chapel. Miss Tansey from the back row rose to speak. Oh, how the winds of change whispered through the town, rustling the leaves with a gentle caress, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I recall the days when none of you would dare sit near me, the whispers of prejudice echoing louder than any spoken word, because my boy was born with a skin too dark for your comfort. Oh, how silence had its price, and it was Eli who bestowed upon these girls what you could never muster, peace. Someone dared to argue, but their words crumbled, dissolving into the heavy air of the church. After a moment that stretched like eternity, the pastor folded his paper, his voice steady yet soft. There will be no formal judgment, he declared. Yet the air was thick with an unspoken decree, expect no welcome. Eli, with a single nod, acknowledged the truth. We never asked for it, he said, his voice firm, but not defiant. He walked out his steps, echoing a resolve as solid as the ground beneath. The women followed their skirts, swishing in a silent symphony of solidarity. No applause, no disdain, just a profound silence of understanding. Back at the ranch, the lamps cast a warm glow, the light a beacon of something new. May opened the door, her face serene, while June set the kettle on the stove with a gentle clink, and Lena swept the floor, her movements as routine as if the world outside hadn't shifted. Yet the air was different. Not everything needed to be spoken to be felt. That night, they sat together on the porch, the silence between them not empty, but full of shared breaths and the soft creak of the swing. The storm had passed, but the scent of thunder lingered, a reminder of the storm within. June's voice soft as the night broke the quiet. They saw us, she said. Eli nodded, the weight of the world in his eyes. They did, and they didn't blink. Good, May murmured, her voice laced with a quiet victory. Let their eyes sting for once. And Lena, already drifting towards sleep, whispered, we didn't come here to be loved, just to be left in peace. They hadn't been embraced by the town, but they weren't cast out either. Sometimes in a place like this, staying was victory enough. The wind returned, not with a howl, but with a whisper curling around the porch posts and eaves like a memory revisiting its home. It moved softly now, almost reverently, as if it too had watched the little ranch, with a hope as weary as the creaks of the old wood. Spring had crept in unnoticed, its gentle touch transforming the landscape, and with it perhaps the hearts of those who dared to look. Weeks had passed since the snow melted, yet only now did the land awaken, embracing the warmth of spring. Beneath Eli's boots, the earth was yielding, no longer hardened by winter's chill. The fence line stood proudly erect, its posts less weary, and the porch, once drooping with sorrow, now carried itself with a semblance of dignity. Lena's basil plants had burst forth of their leaves a vibrant green, stretching towards the sun with the same quiet resiliences that marked her every step. May, with her precise hands, had crafted a new pantry shelf, each plank perfectly aligned, no nails wasted. June, in her thoughtful way, had cleared the old broken piano keys, and now an oil lamp hung above the hearth, where she would read to Simon twice a week, her voice a comforting blanket over the room. They were not chased away, nor were they warmly welcomed, but they endured. And in this endurance there was a silent rebellion, a profound declaration of their right to exist. Eli found himself rising with the dawn, not out of necessity, but from a desire to witness the morning's birth. He cherished the way the light played upon Lena's dress as she crossed the yard, the soft melodies May hummed when she thought she was alone, and June's poised stance as she savored her coffee, one hand on her hip, a woman who had sculpted her life with her own hands. Love was not a word they allowed themselves, yet it whispered through their actions. A coat gently placed over shoulders to ward off the evening chill, a shelf built without a word, tea steeped just as June preferred strong and sweet with honey. These were the silent verses of their lives, a poetry of care that spoke louder than any spoken promise. And just as they began to breathe a sigh of relief, believing the worst was behind them, Finch returned. The barn echoed with the scream, and a flash of orange darted across. Under the vast canvas of the night sky, a sudden commotion broke the serene silence. May burst through the front door, her voice slicing through the calm like a blade. "He's here." Eli, without needing to inquire further, knew the peril at hand. The barn was not yet fully engulfed, but its lower beams were already kissed by the hungry flames that licked upward, eager to consume. Smoke, thick and telling, billowed into the sky as if desperate to convey a dire warning. At the fence, Finch stood, his torch still ablaze, his face contorted in a mask of fury and the remnants of liquor, a visage of a man undone by the loss of control. "You stole them," he bellowed over the fire's voracious crackle. "Paraded them like saints while the whole town mocked me." His words, laced with venom, echoed through the night. Lena, gripping the porch post with trembling hands, felt the weight of the world upon her. June, ever the protector, stepped forward, her voice a beacon of resolve. "Put it out," she commanded Eli. "I'll keep her safe." But May, driven by urgency, was already in motion, her hair streaming behind her like a flag of defiance as she ran with a bucket in hand. Eli, with the strength of desperation, followed suit, hauling water from the trough. Together they fought the fire in a dance of silence, their sweat mingling with the smoke, creating clouds of steam as they battled the encroaching blaze. Twice the flames surged, threatening to engulf them in their fiery embrace. May, in her fervor, slipped her knee, meeting a jagged rake, blood seeping through the tear in her dress. Yet she did not falter. Inside, June enveloped Lena in a protective embrace, pressing a damp cloth to her mouth to shield her from the smoke that crept insidiously beneath the door. Lena's voice, small and fearful, repeated like a mantra, "Don't let him take us back." June's response was firm, unwavering. "He won't, not while I breathe." When the fire finally succumbed to the relentless efforts, reducing to a hiss of wet ash, Eli turned to find Finch vanished, only to realize the man had circled behind the house. June's keen eyes caught the glint of a blade, first the wild, crazed look in Finch's eyes, and his sharp, shaking breaths, a man convinced of his twisted justice. As he lunged towards Lena, Eli, fueled by years of suppressed rage and determination, was quicker. He tackled Finch into the dirt, every punch, every restraint, a release of the pent-up fury and resilience. With every blow, the rage didn't just erupt for this singular moment. Oh, it was much more than that. It was for Anna, his beloved wife who had passed without the dignity she deserved. It was for each young girl who found no refuge but in the shadows of back rooms or in desperate deals. It was for every night this vast, unforgiving land silently absorbed the cries of the sorrowful. Finch bled not to the death, but just enough to remind him of his own mortal fragility. Sheriff Hammond arrived an hour later, summoned by the distant flicker of fire seen from the town. This time, no one dared to ask questions. The sheriff took one glance at Finch, bound and gagged in the back of the wagon, and declared, "We'll be taking him far from here." No charges were brought against Eli, no sermons preached. Perhaps at long last the town had learned to let silence speak in the right direction. The barn bore its scars, yet it stood resilient. By the next week, May had rebuilt the doors with a steadfast determination. June, under the gentle glow of lamplight, began teaching Simon and two others the art of reading. Lena, with newfound inspiration, started sketching on old flour sacks, her charcoal bringing to life soft images of hands intertwined with wildflowers. The ranch didn't just survive, it thrived, and so did they, not as objects of pity or possession, but as individuals with their own stories. On the first truly warm morning of the season, Lena stepped onto the porch, her spirit as fresh as the clean cotton dress she wore. She whispered into the morning air, "I don't flinch when I hear boots anymore." May from the yard grinned and replied, "That's because yours are louder now." And June, setting down her coffee with a thoughtful nod, had added, "Some scars remain, but they don't dictate our destiny." Eli said, little content to observe them as they navigated the space with an ownership that was rightfully theirs. Whether they stayed a year or an eternity mattered not. Eli hadn't rescued them. He had merely made space for them to grow. As the sun gently sank into the western ridge, casting a warm golden light over the ranch, the four of them sat together, each in their own thoughts, yet united in a newfound sense of peace. On the porch, silence embraced them. No one felt the need to break it, for they all knew the storm had already raged and subsided. Yet there they sat, enveloped in the serenity of the aftermath. The wind, once fierce, now whispered gently, no longer a harbinger of turmoil, but a soft witness to their quietude. And I implore you, should you ever find yourself riding across that vast expanse of prairie, and you spot a porch bathed in the warm glow of oil lamps, with the sound of women's laughter, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked bread, tip your hat and continue on your journey. Not out of exclusion, but because peace often thrives in silence, in the unassuming corners, where grace has found its place to flourish. This ranch, though it will never grace the pages of any map, holds a legacy whispered by the winds. As we draw our narrative to a close, let us pause to reflect on the enduring spirit of resilience and quiet strength. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a comment, like, share, or subscribe to our channel. Let us continue to explore the beautiful hidden corners of life together.